One of the great quotes that fundamentally helped me understand a new path that I would choose to walk was famously said by Thomas Aquinas: "To love is to will the good of the other." In that simple statement, we find the very idea of what it means to truly love. It destroys our pride. It teaches us grace to consider what the other is going through. A moment's pause before we make any assumptions or try to come to some conclusion that is to the benefit of ourselves. I think love is the answer to a lot of what ails men today. And that's something that over the course of this, I guess you could call it a diary, something that I want to explore. But sometimes love isn't enough. Sometimes there are things in our lives that we come up against, we find almost impossible, that love cannot on its own be enough. And it's something that in our modern culture of fear and isolation, I find sometimes comes in short supply. And that is of courage. C.S. Lewis famously said, "Courage is not simply one of the virtues, but the form of every virtue at the testing point," which means at the point of highest reality. So what do we stand for? And when it comes down to it, will we stand for it? Welcome to the Sons of Men podcast, a conversation dedicated to meaning in the lives of men, offering a window into the trials of masculinity, where we talk about family, spirituality, creativity, and legacy to better understand each other and to offer solutions for the next generation in an increasingly shallow and hostile world. I'm your host, Kurtis Wiebe, a father and husband, addict in lifelong recovery, and an advocate for men struggling in the shadow of suffering. This is episode 1, Two Roads. It was spring of 2024 this year that I finally decided it was time to speak what has been on my heart for going on almost 10 years. It's manifested in many ways. At once, it was going to be a comic book story created with a friend of mine where I would write it and he would illustrate it. And it was called The Book of Man. It's all rooted in a darkness that I was going through, and I did not have any light. But the traces of it were everywhere in my life. From the time of 2016 onward, I was searching for this answer, and somewhere deep in all of it, I knew that it had so much to do with the men in my life around me who encouraged me, sat with me, saw me through some of the toughest times. But it all came to a head this year when someone within a community that I would have called my own, the comics community, found himself in a place of terrifying isolation where I can only imagine he felt he didn't have the people around him to see him through. I didn't really know Ed Pisker. I knew him tangentially through friends in the comic book industry. But what happened to him, well, that's where this has all started. I remember in 2016, I had gone through something similar. And so the story resonated very deeply with me about a man caught up in online discourse that was dishonest and cruel. And I can only imagine what he was going through when he looked down the road and all he saw was that echoing across time, and how much of his life was wrapped up in what he loved, which was the storytelling medium of comics, and how much he loved talking about them and creating them, and what he saw when that was taken away from him. It reminded me of my past and that hopeless feeling of seeing no future, only this moment. He had every right to be afraid. The culture that we live in now vampirically feasts and delights in the destruction of others. And so many of us behind closed doors will speak angrily about what has happened or how unfair or unjustly someone has been canceled or destroyed. But where were the people with courage? Where was I? This brings me to my own story. On June 19th, 2016, I found myself at a fork in a road. And I think without the support of my community, with the men in my life, I think I might have chosen a similar path that Mr. Pisker did. And so by the grace of God, I survived. But this journey has given me some clarity about where we currently stand in our society and where our place as men can be. For so long, I wrapped up everything in the work that I did, and it was the only thing that gave me meaning. And in 2016, when my career fell to ruin, I was left with nothing. But I stand here today, 8 years later, with some perspective and a journey that I feel I need to share, because I know there are other men out there who have gone through the same and can share their experience or need to hear it, so that when they look down that future road, it's not darkness but hope they see. The death of my career ultimately gave me meaning. It's what has led me to record this episode in the wake of another story of the cruelty and darkness and isolation claiming another victim. And that's not to say that people didn't stand around Mr. Pisker. I don't know the full details of the story, but to me it represents a time for change. What does it mean to be a man today? Everyone's an expert. Everyone seems to have an answer for men who seem to be having a crisis of meaning. And a lot of the answers I'm hearing I don't like. It's kind of reverted to this machismo, chopping wood and being a physical being. Get back to what being a man is about. And I fear that we are shifting far in the other direction without answering the question of why. What are we doing this for? I want to share my struggles with you. And though this is a diary of sorts, I do hope that some of the thoughts that I share will bring comfort or understanding or wisdom to those who need it. I'll be an open book. I'll tell you who I am, what I'm going through. And I would invite you to come on the show and share the same with me, if you're open. And I want this to be a place of solace and comfort, because the world just seems to get darker and more hateful. And I want there to be a place where men come together, share their stories, and find their way forward into the future. Let me tell you a little bit about myself. My name is Kurtis Wiebe. I am a small town prairie boy from the middle of Canada, Saskatchewan, Canada to be precise. I was raised in a Christian town, which I know probably sounds a little strange, but it was built around a Bible school. And my dad was a student at the school there. And so I was raised not only in a Christian home, but in a Christian community. I think in a lot of ways, without even fully understanding that foundation was set for a standard by which I interacted with others. And I think to a certain degree, possibly a naivety about how the world truly operates, the expectation that if I act in this way, so will others. But I cannot deny that those early years were an absolute foundation to the man that I've become today. I remember even when I was a teenager, feeling this sense of disdain for hypocrisy. And I don't need to go into the details, but going to a Christian school, you saw a lot of things that people would say one thing and their actions would be the other. And I'm not talking about some Christian moral standard. I'm just talking about life in general. I sought truth from a young age. And I was always comfortable being vulnerable. It was something that was inherent in our family, something that we valued, that you could speak your mind and there wasn't a risk of damage by opening your heart and letting it be known what you felt. I think a lot of that contributed to what eventually became a very creative perspective on life. You know, there was a lot of possibilities because there was no fear of asking the wrong question. So it led to a creative mind and a creative heart, I suppose. But in my 20s, it led to difficulties, I guess you could say. I ended up wandering through life a lot. You know, I worked so many different kinds of jobs. I worked in a pig barn. I was a bus driver. I sold life insurance to bus drivers, eventually becoming a bus driver. I had worked all these different jobs, but in the back of my mind, I always wanted to write. I always wanted to create fiction. I think without even understanding at the time that sought truth, that asked questions about the human condition. But I wasn't ready, and I didn't think it was something that I could really fully pursue. I suppose in that time, I was searching for meaning, as all young men and all people do at that age. But in that time, I also had a lot of suffering. I had a failed marriage, and I look back on that. I think there was an element where I could say, well, it was all her fault. But that's pride again. I contributed. And I don't think it was ever set up for success. I don't know that I could change anything to make it succeed. But it was a dark time. And two people, or their paths not joined together. It just wasn't meant to be. And so through all my 20s, a married man searching for something greater, looking for a job that might finally fit my heart and my purpose, but fundamentally misunderstanding that I didn't understand the basic question of why. Eventually, I started writing just for the sake of it. I had no other choice. It just bled out of me. And I pursued it in a way that I guess you could almost call it a madness, that there was no promise of success. In fact, there was not even a glimmer of it, but I wrote anyway, and I wrote short stories, and then I discovered comics, and I wrote that, and I failed over and over, and eventually, after years of struggling to find my break, I did. First, it was a small publication, and of course, I thought that would be the beginning of my career, but it stalled out for several years until I almost gave up, and I very fortunately met the right people, made the right connections, and wrote a compelling enough story that I found my work published with Image Comics, which was an incredible experience. And in short time, that initial publication led to more. And eventually that led to one of my greatest successes, a comic book series called Rat Queens. To understand the success of that book, you have to really understand the mentality that I had going into it, that both me and my co-creator, Rock Upchurch, were just going to create a comic that we thought would be fun, and only we would read it, and that would be the end of it. We might get 5 issues, and that would be the end of the Rat Queen's journey, but we were not prepared for what came out of that comic book series. By this stage, I'm sure we've sold in the neighborhood of 1 million copies. It's translated all over the world. Financially, it was the most successful thing I've ever done. It was a success unparalleled. It couldn't compare to anything else that I had experienced in my life up until that point. I had offers coming from all kinds of different people, from Hollywood to other comic book publishers. I had dozens of friends around me that were excited about my success. I mean, you couldn't climb the ladder any higher, and I thought, this is it. This is the rest of my life. But such an ascent is always followed by a fall. And in 2016, a falling out that I had with one of my collaborators on Rat Queens that had come on to fulfill art duties after other complications on the series ended in disaster. And I suppose the long story short is that I lost everything. It wasn't just a falling out of creators, but I fell out of favor with the entire comic book industry, and I found myself completely alone. And I lived in that darkness for a long time. I suppose in the moment I could have reassessed, who am I? What am I doing with my life? What is this all for? But I couldn't bear the weight of that loss, because everything about me was wrapped up in that identity as a successful comic book writer with fans, with friends in the community. What could I do when it was all gone? Well, I drank. What is addiction? Well, it was a major contributor to the crumbling of my life, and it led to a blast radius of everyone around me. I think that journey is still one that I take to this day. I'm in a good place now, but you always have to be wary. Addiction to me is pride. I deserved that career. I deserved the financial success. It is owed me. And because I couldn't bear or carry the truth of it, I drank to make that resentment and fear disappear. Self-pity. How could this happen to me? What have I done? I'm a good person. And possibly the worst aspect of addiction, of the cruelty to even people that I loved. this insidious darkness, this entity that took all meaning and wrapped it up in some liquid that helped me sleep at night, at least for a time. Addiction is pride wrapped in self-destruction. I am worth more. I deserve more. Well, you can probably imagine that didn't last for a very long time before that darkness enveloped me in a way that I could never have fully predicted. The anxiety increased, not decreased. The blast radius grew, and out of it a wave of fear and terror and instability. And then one summer night in 2019, I drank more alcohol than I had ever drank before. And the following day, I was death walking. My daughter was there waiting for me. She'd set up her lemonade stand. I'd promised I'd be there. But I could barely walk up the front porch. My wife's family was visiting, and I had to make some embarrassed excuse that I was not feeling well. So prideful, even in the moment, to just not admit what was obvious to everyone. I disappeared into the basement, and there I hit rock bottom. And to the point of all this theme keeps coming back of the men in my life reaching out when times were darkest. I got a phone call from a friend just to check in on me. He asked me how I was doing, and I lied. I said maybe I had drank a little too much the night before, but I think this friend had known for a long time that I'd been struggling with alcohol. He told me some stories about his own family, how alcoholism had ravaged the people he loved. And in that moment, I realized that I was an alcoholic. And to that friend, you know who you are. You saved my life. And you allowed me to see with unclouded eyes by the love and encouragement and by the fact that you were just there when I needed you most. And that has stuck with me in the years since. And though I've had my ups and downs, I've fallen into addiction again and come out, and I still battle the pride that led me there. That story of my friend reaching out to me in the times that were darkest, that is what this is about. I don't want you to be alone in the suffering. I want you to know that there is someone there who cares, that a community of men coming together to support each other, to love each other, and to have courage to stand for each other when no one else will. That's what the Sons of Men podcast is for. In the next episode, episode 2, Courage Road, I'm going to share the story of my journey and how coming out of alcoholism and isolation and feeling alone led me on an incredible journey into the next era of my life and led me to this very moment of finally sharing my story and seeking to share yours as well. It's a staggering idea that we have as men that when we're young, we can give each other a hug and we can high five and say, "I love you, brother." And then as you get older, towards your teens, everyone makes fun of boys as they do it. It's weird to say that I love you. And so we stop. And then in our 20s, we hang out, we pal around, we drink, take the piss out of each other. And in a way, we're trying to show love, I suppose, to some degree, but it's always wrapped in some kind of machismo brutality. And then in our 30s, we get married, we have kids, we stop talking to each other, we go our own way. We stop getting together as men and sharing our stories, sharing what's going on in our lives because, hey, we've got a life full of expectation. We've got everything. You got the house, you got the wife, you got the kids. But at the end of the day, you're looking down that road and you're just asking, why that future? And maybe you don't know why. The truth is, those friendships from when we were boys are as important now as they were then. And I think we've forgotten that. Maybe this is a way that we can realize those relationships again, those friendships, and understand how important they are, because they are important. They saved me from the brink of a terrible choice on a path with two roads. And I'm glad that I'm still here so that I can talk to you. Thank you for listening to the Sons of Men podcast. I have been your host, Kurtis Wiebe. I'll be recording episode 2 soon. And down the road, I want to open this up to anyone who wants to come on and have a conversation. I'd love to hear your story. I'd love to hear about your journey, and I would love to be there to support you and offer you words of encouragement, whether it's on air or not. God bless.